Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Beverly Diamondstein, and our guests are Beverly Pepper, a sculptor of bold forms whose zest for life and art is internationally known, and Sarah Cushing-Faunce, the widely admired head of the Department of Paintings and Sculpture at the Brooklyn Museum. It's a very special pleasure to welcome both of you here tonight.
Thank you.
Beverly, your sculptures are very widely known from here to Italy, where many of them are made. In fact, where you have made your home since 1951. What was it like for a painter in the 1950s in Italy? Did you belong to any school? What did your work look like?
The beginning. 1951, I was just beginning, and I think I was a painter from...
Can you speak a tiny bit louder, please?
In 1948, I was an abstract painter, and I went to Italy, and I was I went to France, actually, to school. And when I got there, I was so overwhelmed with the post-war problems that from abstract painting, I had this sense of commitment that I had to communicate more with the people. So I completely reversed the way I was painting. I painted a very figurative, very committed social painting, thinking that I would make a dent, or at least pay my dues to what I didn't do in the war. And then after I moved to Italy, I realized that I was talking to very few people. It was much better to do posters than to do any kind of a social content painting. And slowly my painting became far more form and color, and always very dimensional. And I realized at that time that what I really wanted to do was to sculpt. But I couldn't travel. You can't sculpt and travel, I thought. As you know now, it's not true. But then I thought, well, I had to stay in one place, so I stayed and I painted until I took a trip.
And that trip, I guess, that you refer to is a trip to Angkor Wat, where you went as a painter and returned as a sculptor. What happened that triggered that transformation?
Well, it was the most extraordinary place I'd ever been. I was lucky. I got there before the terrible Vietnam War.
When was that trip?
1960, the very beginning of 1960. And Angkor Wat was a place where people went in for one day and went out. It was one of those, you went from Thailand, and you sort of got on an airplane, you stayed one day, and you looked around. It was the quick tour and out. I fell in love with it and stayed 2 weeks. And what was extraordinary wasn't just the Khmer sculpture and the sense of colossal sculpture. And I had already been very much seduced by Japan and Kyoto, and already beginning to understand that I was basically a sculptor, not a painter. But in Angkor, the banyan trees had overgrown the various statuaries left behind. And Angkor had disappeared for years, and suddenly you had the sense of all of time had affected these pieces, and there was something much beyond just the object. And I thought, there's too much dimension that I'm missing in my painting, and I had to get involved with nature and have nature and time meet. It was the most extraordinary sense of suddenly realizing I was changing right there. It was almost a spiritual experience. And I went from there to Kathmandu, where nobody had any pot at that time. I was the only non-Nepalese up there, and met the Dalai Lama's brother, who wanted to tell my fortune, so I left immediately.
You didn't let him tell your fortune?
I was terrified. I mean, what if it came true? I would know it. I made a date with him at 9 in the morning and left. I couldn't get out, because there was a fog, and I kept thinking they're coming to get me to tell me my future. And fortunately, the fog broke, and I got out. And here I am sculpting. Maybe some people would like me to get back. I don't know.
How did you make the transition from 2 to 3-dimensional work?
I don't think things are done consciously, Beverly. That happens. It's just everything is the totaling of a last experience. What happens, and I think you know this, we've talked about this, the fact that whatever it is you've done, by the time, at least for myself, by the time I'm finished, I realize what I haven't done. And that is a means of adding to the next work, and each piece of each experience becomes another piece of work. It isn't a conscious thing, it's an unconscious thing. The conscious thing is the censor.
I see you nodding in agreement, Sarah. I assume you're talking, nodding, in fact, not only in terms of Beverly's work, but artists in general. And rather than having any narrow partisan interests, I still would like to ask you about a show that you were responsible for that received a great deal of attention. And I'm referring to the recent women artists from 1550 to 1950. Perhaps you might explain what your gesture meant.
Well, I was simply assenting to the what Beverly was saying about the fact that I don't think, in general, that artists work in such a deliberate way. I think it's or such a analyzing beforehand sort of way. It's more a matter of plunging in and then seeing what happens. I don't know quite how that relates to the exhibition at the museum, which I hope many of you had a chance to see. It's kind of you to give me credit for bringing it there, which I will accept. It actually was organized by 2 art historians, both women, and Sutherland Harris, who's now at the Metropolitan Museum, and Linda Nochlin, who teaches at Vassar. And it was quite an eye-opener for a great number of people, I think, particularly in this country where we don't see that many old master pictures and think of them as all done by old masters. And to see these Dutch and Italian and French paintings of the 17th and 18th century that were painted by women was, I think, very instructive to a lot of people.
And what do you see as the short or long-term result of that exposure?
Well, I think it's one of those, it's almost like an unconscious thing. It's just one more step that people don't consciously think, well, now I know there was such and such an artist in the 17th century who did very wonderful pictures and was a woman, but it's just an incremental thing, a part of the growing awareness which one hopes to become less and less self-conscious, or that the awareness will be less and less self-conscious and simply automatic. It's like the difference between manners or, civility or courtesy that's absolutely spontaneous and you don't think about what the rules are and then, trying to apply it, say, what should I do in this situation? It should be spontaneous awareness that men and women are, when it comes to works of art and intellect, are human beings together.
Beverly, you've always had a very individualized approach to your work, to your life. How has this affected you? The whole awareness of the role of the woman artist.
But I've never thought of myself as a woman artist. I think of myself as a woman. And I love being a woman, but I've never thought of myself as being a woman artist. I'm deeply committed to art and committed to helping women who have problems in terms of getting a chance to show and even any kind of learning experience. But I'm against any kind of segregation and do not want to function as a woman artist.
There are other kinds of isolation, and sometimes it is geographical. I wonder if you could tell us what it's been like to live abroad for the last 27 years, a period when that was marked certainly by the ascendancy of American art, when artist after artist has come here and told us in varying degrees how important New York was or is as a center for art. How has that affected your work?
Well, it was a very serious problem for me because I'm a New Yorker, and I've been created by New York, and everything I do is indigenously American. And for a while, the period I mentioned when I was working in the isolation of painting and commitment, post-war commitment, the work I did was very Europeanized, but very self-consciously Europeanized. The moment I began to sculpt, I entered the 20th century in the sense of technology. And I worked in factories. And factories all over the world have no nationality. And therefore it freed me to be myself. Also, I have lived on both sides of the ocean doing the work I do. I worked in 1962, when I worked for the Spoleto Festival, I worked up in North Italy. And I worked in a U.S. Steel subsidiary factory of Italcida, so it was very American. When I came here, I worked in different factories, and I've constantly renewed my own culture. But it was very difficult for me to be accepted as an expatriate during the most chauvinist period in American history. It was the most difficult period. I never suffered from being a woman artist. I suffered from being a woman, an artist who lived in a foreign country, who was not paying her dues daily to the New York establishment. What it did was make me that much more aware of my Americanism and my intent to declare my natural birthright. So I'd come back here and work here a great deal. But it was much easier for me for many reasons. And in my most irreverent form, when people would ask me, as I told Sarah the other day, I think, why I lived abroad, I'd say it was the domestic situation. If you remember, it was the 50s, and everyone thought I meant political, and I kept saying, no, I could have domestics to take care of my children. That was the reason I stayed. It was a way of being free. But I think that you cannot lose your roots that easily. You don't, if you're an artist. You are always the same person. You just grow, but always with the same root.
You mentioned when you went to Spoleto in 1962. I guess there are not many sculptors who can mark such a precise moment as you can when their work went, I guess, from wood to steel and iron. And I assume you refer to the period when 10 sculptors were commissioned by the subsidiary of U.S. Steel to fabricate works. Among those 10, there were 3 Americans: Alexander Calder, David Smith, and Beverly Pepper. Perhaps you should tell us something about that period.
Well, it's very easy. I was so overwhelmed by belonging that it became an absolute landmark for me, milestone in my life. I had a show in Rome at the time that Giovanni Carandenti was choosing the people he was going to invite to the Spoleto Festival. And my show was in November, and he came and he was very impressed with the work. But I must say it was wood and bronze. That is, not fused bronze, but bronze done in a rather direct way, inserted in the wood. And he asked me if I could weld. I do come from Brooklyn, so I said, why? And he said, because if you can weld, I'm putting together this show, and I think it would be fantastic if you would be the 3rd American. And Giovanni Carandenti did not know there was going to be a women's movement, but he wanted a woman. And he thought these were very strong sculptures. So I said, when is this show? And he said it was going to be in June, and this was November. And I said I could weld.
And by June you could.
By June you could weld.
That's right. I immediately went out and hired myself out, paid an ironmonger to hire me. He thought I was the craziest thing he had ever seen. And I maintained that I wouldn't have made curvilinear sculptures had I hired myself out to somebody who hadn't been making round gates. But he was the man next door. So
your very first works are characterized by a loopy openness.
That's right. Which really was not the first works I did. In Spoleto, I did works that were, actually it was Piombino. I did works that were very strong, almost in the school of the found object. I had, they were I cut up a railroad car, I cut up a huge
Like that one I
tank.
saw yesterday.
That's
that
right.
big sheet.
But I never showed them because I was so innocent. I knew nothing about what was happening in the American art world, and I thought that since David Smith was doing found objects and this belonged to, and Gonzalez had done it, I obviously couldn't possibly do something that other people were doing, and I wouldn't show the pieces I did. David Smith saw them and begged me to show them, and I said, no, they'll say I took them from you. Well, now that I've seen them years later, they don't look at all like David's work, and they were the best work. Instead, I showed works that seemed to me more original, which showed you how an artist really cannot judge his or her own work.
Is that a description that you would agree with, Sarah? You come into contact for all of your life with artists. At Columbia University, at the Brooklyn Museum, as a consultant to the Jewish Museum, as a curator of many shows. Would you agree with that appraisal of the self-evaluating capacity of most artists?
I hate to make generalizations about that kind of thing because I do think I think it is more rare for an artist to be able to do that, have that kind of detachment, just as it's rather rare for an artist to be able to really analyze and take a critical point of view toward his own work. It's a kind of a freaky quality, you might say. It's nice if you have it, but I wouldn't expect it.
Well, then who knows best? Is it curators? Is it critics?
Well,
The artist, in the end.
In the end. I think
the artist.
I think the artist knows best, certainly about what he's doing and about his own work. But in a situation like what you're saying there, someone more detached might have been able to come and say, look, this stuff is really what you should show. Well, let's say David Smith in that situation was a critic or a curator.
Yes,
he was not functioning as an artist.
But David, at that point, was relating to something that he was himself doing.
Yeah,
Now, in the end,
true.
I didn't have enough experience. I would be much more positive about what I would reject and accept at this point because I would have a total body of work I could look at. What happens now, and it's terribly important in terms of, I think, even other artists, I always hate a piece of work I have just finished because I am now ahead of the work after I have finished it. I see what I should have done after I have finished it. But given enough time and space, I then find that I'm able to re-examine the work and understand it within context of the whole body of the work. The word hate really is strong, but I really am dissatisfied when I finish a piece of work because by then I know what I should have done.
How much influence did David Smith have on your work?
Well, I was unaware they had any influence on my work. I had a great influence on my personality in the sense that I'd never known. Living abroad, you're asking, I should have answered your other question about living abroad. I lived in absolute isolation. I didn't know a real artist. It never occurred to me I was a real artist.
What about all those writers that you were surrounded by?
I was surrounded by writers, and they were literary, and I had a literary point of view. It took me years to rid myself of literature from my work. I remember one day saying to my husband, looking at some duchos in Siena, I don't care who cut whose head off. I want to look at the forms and the shape, because he was always telling me the story. When I got to Spoleto, and that's why it was a milestone for me, it wasn't just David Smith. There was Lynn Chadwick, there was Calder for a second, but there was Chalida, there was all these other people. And we were sitting around in what we call rapping now. We were all sitting around and talking, drinking, and discussing what was going right and wrong. And I discovered that we all had the same problems. I thought that my problems were mine, and I didn't know how to tell them about my problems. It never occurred to me, for instance, that you could do 17 pieces of work in a month. So I didn't tell anyone that I did that many pieces. I kept it a secret. It didn't seem like a real artist should do that much work.
Actually, I think it was Menotti once told me a story that during that period, David Smith did so much work that at a certain point they had to stop him because the production was so great. Is that correct?
Absolutely. But I tell you what happened was that we had every single thing you dream about to have happen. That is, any number of helpers you wanted, you could tack something together. Someone would continue the welding. You wanted, I told you, I cut a railroad car apart. Cut that apart, like, they cut it apart. While they were cutting that apart, I had 10 other people chopping. You know, the whole thing was so unbelievable that, and you see, it was interesting that someone like Lynn Chadwick, who I think did his very best piece of work there, and he never repeated it again because he had no kinship with it. He was a man who wanted things cast, and he did this huge welded sculpture, an incredible yellow and black structure. But he was so unaccustomed to this form that he felt uncomfortable with it for the rest of his life. He never understood what he had done. It had nothing to do with him. But excuse me, but other artists, so he did one piece in that month because he was becoming acquainted with it. I, on the other hand, felt such freedom, but I kept it a secret. I didn't know. Afterwards, when I saw all these things David showed, and we discussed it, well, it was like open sesame. I suddenly realized it was about quality. It wasn't about quantity, but you could do a lot of quality with that much help.
That was in pre-Corten steel days. What did the surface of his work look like then? And since you were so closely associated with him during that period, do you have any recollection of his intentions?
Well, first I would like to explain that he was in Genoa and I was in Piombino, and I was his translator by telephone. And so it was his work I saw afterwards when he brought the work down to Spoleto. So we're talking about 5-6 hours by car driving. But he particularly wanted the color of the burning, of the welding burns, the steel as he found it, to be retained. And he spent a great deal of time trying to find a way to protect the surface. And what I had done is find him a transparent varnish that was really a plastic called Isophane, and is a polyurethane. And he put on 12 to 15 coats of this to make sure that discoloration, the reds, the colors, everything else, were retained. Corten did not exist. Actually, I received Corten the following year because I worked in a U.S. steel mill, and Corten is really a brand name. It does not exist. It's got a number. It's a kind of non-corrosive steel, and U.S. Steel was very intelligent at calling it Corten, and then you didn't have to remember M67254 when you were going to order it. And it was only the following year then Corten really became part of the artist's vocabulary, but he never used it, and he wasn't interested in rust at any point. Anyway, he was a painter first, and he loved painting his sculptures. Other people, you know, young artists today and old artists too, they use sprays, the surfaces are big brushes. David used a small brush. You could see the little paint quality, the marks on them. They were painted like a painter. He loved it. He put on coat after coat after coat, and it was a painting for him as well as a sculpture.
Sarah, how important do you think the work of a critic is to the work of an artist?
You mean directly to the, in what sense? I mean, you mean the artist absorbing the message of the critic?
How important are critics to the work of artists?
I don't think they're very important to the work of artists. I don't think they should be too important to the work of artists. I think they're important for, the work of critics is important as a kind of selection process, because I do think there's got to be a constant sifting. There's a great many people, particularly today, making art of one kind or another, and it's all, from one point of view, a subjective point of view, it's all a perfectly wonderful activity, but just as sort of singing in the bathtub is not necessarily a public statement, there's a lot of sifting that has to be done with every form of art, whether it's writing or painting. And I do think that that's got to be done, and critics make a great deal of mistakes. It's not a matter of being perfect all the time. But I don't think that, so I think they do that as a public function, but I don't think that it should be particularly relevant to what the artist is about himself.
Do you think daily criticism, do you think a critic can do justice to going to see a show?
Oh, the daily criticism, well, that's a... I think no, in the straight answer, no. But on the other hand, I expect it has to go on in some way, that kind of weeding out.
Beverly, you're going to be part of that Sculpture International Forum in Toronto. And the panel that you are a part of is critics, friends, or
I
foe.
consider this below the belt.
No, we're giving you a dress rehearsal.
No,
Yeah, we're going to answer that question if you choose to.
Which, are they friends or are they foes?
I think when you have a critic friend,
Yes, they are friends.
they're better than Hungarians.
Only just. Huh?
I think that criticism, for the sake of selling art, writing in the daily papers and putting it part of the marketplace and making art part of making it a commodity, is a very destructive thing to the artist.
Yes.
I think that reflective criticism that that is done over a long period of time, that is not specifically individual, but rather looking at the different schools of art, attitudes, what is happening, it can be very interesting and provocative to an artist. But I think that the idea that someone works for a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years on a number of works for a show, and then someone walks in for 15 minutes, walks out, writes their 10 lines for the only newspaper that publishes it now, and someone runs in and buys 10 of these because it's gotten a rave and does that. I think it's extremely destructive. And I find that the whole concept of art being available to the mass daily is a very destructive thing. It's removed some of the mysticism that's got to do with art. Don't you think so, really?
Yes, I think, yeah, that's quite true. The whole notion that people have now, the sort of well, the very connection of criticism with selling. I mean, it's, even if it's not the case, people think of it as the case. People think of
Do you think of this as an age of collectors rather than creators?
Well, I think there are creators at work as a sort of cultural tendency. Yes, I think it's an age of collectors in the same sense that it's in an age of anthologizers and packagers. I mean, there's an awful lot of that tendency intellectually in our culture, I think.
After you. I was going to shift from this for a moment to talk directly about your work. You may not be influenced by critics, but you are indeed influenced by architecture. And I'm thinking of the size and the texture and the risk that you take in your work. Is that a reasonable thing for me to assume?
I think anybody who makes any piece of art or does anything that's got to do with their own personal statement, whether it's 3 inches high or 3 miles high, takes risks. I mean, if you're going to be an artist, you must take risks. If you don't take risks, you might as well not even try being an artist. I'm not interested. I'm not at all involved in architecture, Barbara Lee. I'm interested in scale, not size, which is quite another thing. So that
is your work influenced by architecture? I'm especially thinking, I guess, of the land pieces in New Jersey.
Well,
But Dartmouth.
I think that
where it's almost an amphitheater.
Yes, from that point of view, I would say yes. But I'm involved with history. I mean, that's really more has to do with history than it has to do with architecture per se. You see. Go ahead.
But what about that? I was thinking of the San Diego. Was it San Diego piece? Where I haven't seen it, but I've seen photographs. Where the commission was to place a large sculpture in a given spot in front of a new building, which then had another building coming out at another angle and a sort of bridgeway across, and this gap between. And instead of, as you were telling me, instead of just coming in and designing a sculpture for a space, you designed the whole space, really, or you
Yes,
reset the space
Sarah,
and
they-
made a mall and put the sculpture somewhere else, which is an architectural thing to do, in a way.
It's true, but they
Yeah.
gave me a space, and when they looked at the plans, it said there were going to be 5 60-foot trees around the sculpture. I was quite
No, all
absolute-
I'm saying is
I
that
mean,
your solution was a sort of
It was a
space
space, it
planning
was a
solution.
space,
Yeah,
it was a
you're
space
designing the whole
solution. A
space, yeah.
sculpture
But don't you do
today
that
is
all
not
the
a,
time?
but we
Yeah.
take,
You do
but
that
yeah,
all
I
the
do it all
time.
the time.
Well,
But
perhaps
but
you
it's
should
not
tell us.
architecture. Sculpture today is not on a pedestal anymore. We do not have to use the pedestal. The ground you walk on becomes part of the sculpture. It becomes, and it's an environment, and I am particularly interested in the experiencing of a sculpture. The sculpture that Sarah's talking about was an area that simply was going to be an embellishment, the use of the government's 1% to make a sculpture on a pedestal someplace before a grid that looked like a bunker. And it was
typical modern building.
it was an absolutely an antisocial area, and I really am against the idea of non-continuity, anti-people, and it was a courthouse anyway. And people who go to courthouses are very preoccupied with problems, and I wanted to create something that would give them an experience. And so I did open the space and have them close the street and ask me if it's involved with politics. There's a lot of politics to get them to close the street. But it was using the space as sculptural space and not architectural space. The architect was benefited by my making the sculptural space more cohesive with his architecture. I don't know whether you think that's so.
Oh, yes, I do, indeed.
You've said often that your work relates to man and nature and the environment, and you want this whole sense of participation, both of the creator and the spectator. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, there's that sort of overused word of alienation, but it's just every time I come I live in the country. I live very far from where things happen every day, and I read the papers a week or 2 weeks
You're
late.
not referring to Rome now, but
No,
to Todi.
I live in
Todi,
Todi, and I find it very pleasant to live there because when I read the newspapers, I know it's past what I'm reading, so my anxieties are already calm. You know, no problem. Today I heard the news before it was told because I spoke to Italy and I learned that Moro was shot. I knew it right then and there, and I was filled with anxieties. What was happening in Italy. But had I lived in the country, I would have had it 10 days later and I would have known what was all right. Well, my idea is that we're living in a very difficult time, and what I'm trying to do is to make works of art that will have some kind of sense of the Corinthia, the idea that, you know, the Corinthia where in the bull ring the bull goes where he feels safe as the matador comes after him and he stands there. I think we all need Corinthias in our lives, and I think I try, and I don't know how successful I am, but I try, at least in many of the works I do, to give people a sense of their own space they can go into it and use that space. And also try to bring nature into it so that somewhere along the changing seasons become part of the work I'm doing, whether it's reflective in the sense that you see the sky and the reflections, or whether you actually, physically, I'm using the land, the sand, the water, whatever it is I'm doing. And that's what I mean by the trying...
You talk about reflections, you mean those polished surfaces of yours.
Yes, like this here.
This is an earlier piece.
Yes,
when you
but
talk
you
about
see,
nature,
but that's also very much illusionary. So sometimes you find the sky finishes the sculpture, sometimes the sand or the it's difficult. I wish I had something to show you here, but what I
talk
try
of your
to
work is illusionary very often.
yes, well, it's also once again the idea of trying to get beyond the dimension of constant realism. The reality of daily living is very oppressive. So that I'd like to try and get beyond that kind of realism so that not only can it be my fantasy that I'm doing for myself, but to share the fantasy.
If the need for haven and shelter impels many of us much of the time, it seems that your choice of location these days is an especially precarious one. What is it like to be an artist in Italy, and how has it affected other artists in that particular political environment at this time?
An Italian friend of mine said to me when somebody was kidnapped not too long ago, first of all, you don't have to worry about that, Beverly, because you're not rich enough to be kidnapped. And secondly, you're living in a country where they still name the streets after artists. And it's I don't have any of that problem. I'm not living in the middle of it. I'm very filled with anxieties about Italy. I love the country, but I have lived there more than half my life, and I feel that I have no right to leave it because it's not at its best. I think that I try to stay and contribute. I think every place is uncertain. I don't feel the daily problems of the students. I'm not in the university. I'm very sympathetic with their problems. But you know, you've been there. It's very isolated. I live in the country where I'm alone most of the time.
It has a stable rural pattern.
But how is that?
But I'm living in a 15th century tower. I mean, it's about as far away you can get from the cosmopolitan problems. And my studio is a small factory. My dream, other women want mink coats. I always wanted a factory. I have a factory. And
what about other artists in Italy, particularly those that don't have your mobility or duality?
Well, no, Piero D'Orazio is filled with anxiety all the time. He lives in the same town. He's a very political animal, and he works, and he's very involved with making manifesti and things like that. But Buri lives also in the same area, and he's not a political animal, and he lives very sheltered and stays out of the political arena. I think it's no different than if you're living right here and the long hot summers or anything else that happens.
We talked before about the relationship of nature to your work. I'm thinking, especially in the most recent period, of the use of grass and other elements that you use with sculpture. Can you explain that to us?
Well, what do you want me to explain?
Rather than citing, you said there's no longer a pedestal. Well, your sculpture is a part of the earth, in a sense.
All right, I just did a sculpture in Dartmouth that I've just finished, and the sculpture in Dartmouth is set in an island that the students used a great deal going around it, and
grassy.
It's a grass island. Yes,
yeah.
that's right. And what I've done is I've built a sculpture that is partially metal, and the voids are filled in with sod, and I've reshaped this very flat New England landscape so that there are hills and it is an undulating area. But what I did was paint it white, so that what happened is that the sculpture has a seasonal relationship to the people who see this sculpture. And the seasonal relationship is that basically based on the fact that at Dartmouth, 5 months of the year there's snow. And within that period, the sculpture absolutely disappears. It's covered with snow. And as spring comes, the snow melts and the sculpture slowly emerges, and the green is somewhat brown, and it slowly becomes green, and it has a whole life of its own, which requires then an awareness on the part of the viewer because something is happening. As a matter of fact, I just lunched with someone who was at Dartmouth, and I said, "Did you take any photographs of my sculpture under the snow?" And they said, "But there was nothing to see. It disappeared."
There might be some sort of...
How did that work evolve, Beverly? It started out at one scale and ended up at another.
Well, it ended up with me being bankrupt. I mean, I started out to be a 35-foot sculpture, and one of the things about outdoor sculptures is that no matter how big you make it, they're never big. They don't work.
They're always dwarfed by the
they're always,
sky.
building sky, and it seemed to me that the sculpture needed to be much longer, and I kept adding a piece and adding a piece. But I did this in Texas, too, till it became 280 feet long. But in Texas, it was financed by the Texans. But here, I did this. And when it got, at one point, it was 150 some odd feet. When I brought it to Dallas, to Dartmouth, and I brought it...
It was fabricated in Italy and assembled here?
Well, you see, the metal elements were fabricated in my beautiful factory, which was my studio, but they all call it my factory, so I call it my factory. And I brought these pieces in a big container. The sculpture actually is smaller than what I brought, because when I set the sculpture into the landscape, I realized that the light and the physical conceptions are one thing that you take with you when you're actually putting them together. In land art, site sculpture really has to be flexible and change. I made a complete, I guess, almost 140-degree shift angle
yeah.
when I put it in the ground. After we built this huge tunnel, I discovered that it really was, there were too many elements in the sculpture because of all the buildings around it. So I took home about 12 feet of sculpture.
But you really want it to be a natural formation, so to speak, earthwork in a certain way.
Well, it's really a site piece, not an earth piece, because an earth piece, we're not using really any other materials than the geological materials. But this, I had fabricated forms that were really solids that had to be filled by the earth. And that's what had to be reconstructed on the site, and that's what made me make it longer and shorter and change the degree of it. And I think that's very important. You talked about risk. When you're making site pieces, you are risking making mistakes, and you have to have a lot of courage to change them. I find that's the hardest thing, is to give it up, to remove, to say this shouldn't be.
And take it out.
Take it out. Particularly when it's a lot of metal. You know?
Sarah, you have a mission too. In fact, you've said that one of your missions is to restore virtue to the word ornament.
Oh, yes, we did talk about that, didn't we?
Yes.
But she's the most virtuous person there is, so she can do it.
I didn't put it in my notes there. Yes, well, ornament, or maybe even decorative, I think, even more so, because that tends to be the word that gets used as a put-down. That painting is just decorative. It's often said about something that someone doesn't like, and it's often very hard to describe, or it's not exactly analyzed as to what that word decorative in the bad sense means. And I just have a sort of general interest in reclaiming decorative as a good word, because of all the great works of art from Matisse on back to Giotto, you might say, going in reverse, which were great works of art that in one sense are performing the function of decorating the wall and providing an experience that when you walk into a room, before you stop to analyze anything, makes you feel good. It's a sort of sudden injection of pleasure, which I think true decoration does for you, and then you can go on from there to see, where it goes from there.
May I ask a question? But what do you think, Sarah, in a time when we're living in a product society, and the products are also beautifully designed, and design becomes part of inherent in people's taste, and therefore frequently the concept of decoration, as far as Giotto goes, it had to do with not only just filling the space, but it wasn't just pleasing the eye. It was also
far
it
more
had
than
to
that. Yeah.
They were very spiritual. Today, the decoration is part of the consumer society.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Maybe the thing to do is to draw a distinction between decorative and ornamental, and cast ornamental into that range of things that are pleasurable in a more trivial way.
How do you think of ornamental as embellishment? Or, in fact, even in an earlier reference, in larger works, when they are part of a natural formation?
Well, the word ornamental has a particular negative thing.
Is that Milano influence?
Well, no, it's got to do with the fact that architects are forever asking for embellishment for their building. Yeah. They ask the sculptor or the painter to fill up the gaps that they have managed not to succeed in making. Is there an architect in the audience?
We've had several guests and several here too, but they generally tell us it's ivy rather than sculpture. How does one get a commission, Beverly? No matter where I am, no matter what part of the earth, if it is Brussels or Italy, if it is Israel or Dallas, there is a Beverly Pepper. How do you manage to get so many commissions?
I get them in the mail. And since I never open my mail until weeks later, sometimes I almost miss them. I really don't know. The commissions that I've been getting are from the NEA, the GSA, and they have files of lovely slides. I do send my slides. Where's Amy? She sends my slides, and they have the slides. And then there are various committees, and I'm just one of the lucky ones, as that lady said.
What are you working on now?
Well, I'm going to Niagara Falls tomorrow to change the direction.
Well, we know about your force and that triumph of the will. However, what do you have in mind?
Well, only the shadow knows.
A secret. It's
Can you give us a tiny...
Actually, I must say, I think that the Niagara Falls, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen was when they turned them off. Did you see the falls when there was nothing?
I've never seen
I've never
Niagara
seen
Falls.
them. Isn't that awful?
Yes.
I've never seen them on, but I saw them off, and it was unbelievable that you could stop the falls. I'm involved in a project to sort of work out a site piece that will take the Japanese from going on the Canadian side and bring them over to the New York side.
Ah, New York State. Yeah.
But,
Is it part of Art Park?
no, I'm not telling any more. You
All
could
right.
torture me. But
We won't. In fact, you've pleased us so much, all that we can do is thank you a great deal. Thank you, Beverly Pepper. Thank you, Sarah Faunce. And thank you for being with us, too.
Thank you. Thank you. Love for your playing. Love for your playing.
He signaled about 10 minutes ago, and I think I have got to go.
You got to